Okay, everyone, welcome to today's lecture talk. This is an event organized by Peace Islands Institute, New York. We have the pleasure of hosting well-known Islamic Studies professor John Esposito from Georgetown University, who's a professor of religion and international affairs. He is the founding director of the Center for Muslim Christian Understanding, and he also currently works on the Bridge Initiative. I would highly recommend you Google the Bridge Initiative Georgetown to find out a little bit more about what they're doing, particularly in regards to Muslim diaspora in the United States. We have the pleasure of hosting John on this very topical theme, and it's titled Understanding the Other, the Case of Muslim Diaspora in Europe and the United States. Again, welcome to everyone. While you're here, you'll have the opportunity after John's talk to ask questions in the chat box to the right on your YouTube screen, which you should be able to see. And of course, we would appreciate you liking and subscribing to our YouTube channel and the various other websites and social media that you should see links to. So again, welcome to Dr. Esposito.
Delighted to be here, and great to have this opportunity to talk with you all. Let me begin by telling you a little bit about who I am. I was born and raised in Brooklyn, Italian-American, Roman Catholic. For a good part of my early life, from about the age of 14 to the age of 24, I was away to become a Capuchin Franciscan priest. I was never ordained a priest, but I left after 10 years. And then I did my first degree in Catholic theology, and I taught Catholic theology at Rosemont College for 6 years in Pennsylvania. And while I was in graduate school, my intention was to finish a doctorate in that area, but I became very interested in Islam. Although initially I was resistant to it, the professor that we had was very persuasive, and I finished a PhD in Islamic studies and minored in Hinduism and Buddhism. The interesting thing about this period of time is that when I finished my degree in 1974, for example, there were virtually no jobs in the United States to just teach Islam. I was hired to teach world religions at the College of Holy Cross in Massachusetts, where I stayed for about 22 years. The knowledge about Islam in the late 60s, 70s, and right up until the Iranian Revolution was minimal. Professional organizations like the American Academy of Religion, the largest academy for the study of religion, had no sections on Islam. The Middle East Studies Association of North America very rarely covered Islam because in general, the mood was one of modernization, meant the secularization and westernization of societies. So as one social scientist said in one of his books, The Passing of Tradition, the choice of Saudi Arabia, for example, was Mecca or mechanization, as in modernization. Everything changed with the Iranian Revolution. It was as if suddenly Islam, the Middle East, etc., moved from the side, from the periphery to the center. And I think it's important to recognize that up until that time, diplomats also were not necessarily who worked in the region, had nothing to do with understanding Islam, Muslims, Muslim culture. It wasn't until the early 1980s that the Foreign Service Institute introduced courses that dealt with Islam in the Middle East, in South Asia, Southeast Asia, etc. In 1993, I moved to Georgetown to create the Center for Muslim Christian Understanding. It's located in the School of Foreign Service, which is the School of International Affairs. And basically, in terms of myself and what I've done some 55 books, many of them with Oxford University Press. You can, if you're interested in what kind of books I've done, just go on Amazon and look me up. You'll see all of the books there. 2 books are particularly relevant for today's talk. One was Islamophobia and the Challenge of Pluralism in the 21st Century. And the other, a book called Who Speaks for Islam? What a Billion Muslims Really Think. The Who Speaks for Islam was basically based on a 5-year Gallup world poll, which looked at some 35 Muslim countries over a 5-year period. And out of that data that we had, we then were able to raise questions, about who are Muslims? What do they think about their religion? What about the role of women in society? What's the attitude? How about the question of religion and politics? How do they view the West, Western countries, Western leaders? How about violence? How about the attitude towards terrorism, etc.? So let me move to the main part of my talk, the emergence of Muslim communities. Let me begin by saying that, as I said earlier, I was raised in Brooklyn, which is in cosmopolitan New York City. And yet we were basically, much of New York consisted of ethnic or religious neighborhoods. Islam and Muslims were invisible in America, not that they weren't Muslims, but the Muslims that were there would often be identified at best as so-and-so's an Egyptian, so-and-so's a Turk, so-and-so's a Lebanese, but it wasn't that they specifically were identifying it in terms of Islam itself. And I remember being in Australia a number of years ago and speaking to the sort of like the Foreign Affairs Committee. And the chair was a woman of Greek origin. As a young girl, she had come from Greece to Australia. And she commented that it was really later on, and particularly after 9/11, that people in Australia began to, many people, to begin to talk and identify people as Muslim, rather than just saying that they were Lebanese, they were, etc. Okay. So that absence in America, that is that sense of visibility, for example, again, in the 1970s and 80s, you had almost no mosques. Most people didn't even know where they were. The oldest mosque was actually in Iowa, and an old mosque that was called the Mosque of Boston was actually in the suburbs of Boston. So that visibility that we now see today of Muslims, of mosques, but also of other religions, Hindu temples, Buddhist temples, etc., was really invisible in the 60s, 70s, and into the 80s. But it was really the Iranian Revolution that put Islam and Muslims on the map, and certainly in terms of my career. I often say that I owe my career, my first Lexus, to Ayatollah Khomeini and the revolution. That is, what I did before the Iranian Revolution, that as being a young professor, etc., there were minimum ability for publishing. Certainly people were not interested in publishing books, almost never invited to speak, certainly never invited to go to Washington, as happened after the Iranian Revolution, as a consultant to government there. And I've done, over the years now, consulting for governments in the European Union, consulting for governments in Asia. All of that just didn't exist at the time. And so the engagement of Americans, and I would say even people in the UK in general, with Islam and Muslims was with the Iranian Revolution. Now, the problem with that is, if what you're engaging is with an Iranian Revolution, which basically, among other things, took Americans hostage, and a good deal of the rhetoric was to denounce both the Soviet Union and also USA as a symbol of the West, and to speak that, the path to be followed was Allah. But it was that image that people had every day when they would look at the TV, especially during the hostage crisis, was really seeing a religion that was seen as, chanting as they were in the streets also, death to America, without any context in which to place them. So, for example, a very popular morning show host stopped the news one morning and said, let me just give you a little background on Islam. This is before they were going to move to talking about the hostages and have live coverage. He said, there's a religion called Islam. It's the second largest of the world's religion. It has a book called the Quran, Revelation, and a prophet named Muhammad. I mean, that was about all that he said, which is remarkable when you think that even at that time, Islam was the second largest religion in the world. So that lack of knowledge becomes a real problem. Now, what about the American Muslim experience vis-a-vis the European experience? And here I'm generalizing, but in general, when it came to American Muslim populations, at a certain point in the 60s and 70s, you had a fair number of people who were professionals who wanted to leave the country to do better. That is, professionals in Muslim countries who wanted to do better in the West, and in this case, let's say America, who would be coming here. Others who were very bright, etc., came here to study. And then there was a period of time where governments were sending their people over and paying for them to study, governments, Kuwait, Iran, etc. The idea was that people would go home. Well, in fact, while some people went home, many of them wound up staying here for a variety of reasons. It could be a job that it paid well, but it could be very much that they were professionals. Certain areas of medicine, etc., just weren't popular in the countries they were going back to, didn't have the machinery that they needed. And also if they were going back to basically an authoritarian government versus staying here, that also could be attractive. So what we have then is a generation, a first and then a second and a third generation, but basically a good deal of that influx were people with educations who could then fit into the system, across the system, and move up after a while more easily. On the other hand, in the European situation, many of the Muslims that went there were welcomed by European countries like the UK and Germany and France, but they were welcomed as laborers. In other words, often many of them were laborers who came, and they were laborers who were brought in and were offered jobs. The laborers took the jobs in order to send some money back home, hoping to make enough to maybe go back and live there. But even their host countries thought they're coming in as laborers, they're hired, and then they'll probably go home. It was only a short time ago that Germany allowed people who were even second generation, let alone the first generation, to have citizenship. So the European experience and the development of that community lagged and continues to lag a bit behind that of the American Muslim community, certainly in terms of the immigrants. I'm not talking about African Americans who were here, and many of whom were descendants of slaves. So there's that disparity, okay, in terms of where people are within the system, position-wise and professionally. An example I would give from America is the enormous number of, for example, doctors, physicians, lawyers, engineers, and many of them are people who are now in their 60s and 70s, let alone the younger generation. I think the largest medical group in the United States is of Pakistani physicians, as another example. Now, what about Islamophobia? How did that come about, etc.? And here I'm talking about, if you will, modern or contemporary Islamophobia. Sure, there were issues in the past, both in terms of anti-Muslim attitudes, anti-Christian, anti-Semitic. But I'm talking more about the sort of modern period. Interestingly, in the early 1980s, a very prominent Christian Arab named Edward Said, who wrote a famous book called Orientalism, among others, but was a very famous professor, and not only in the US, he would lecture all over the world. But at one point in 1981, in a book of his, he wrote a piece saying that a curious situation had arose, and that, in fact, increasingly for many in America, there was a problem with Islam. In other words, he was saying that this attitude was emerging, that somehow there was a problem with Islam and Muslims. And of course, this would have been occurring right after the Iranian Revolution. Okay? It was only, though, in the early 1990s that you began to really see a strong resurgence of basically Islamophobia or anti-Muslim attitudes, behavior, discrimination. And that grew out of a couple of things that were happening. In the US, and two people I'm going to refer to are people that were read not only in the US, but in Europe. Bernard Lewis, one of the most prominent scholars of Middle East, wrote an article called Roots of Muslim Rage. And he ended it by talking about the fact that what we had was something that had existed throughout history, and that is the seeds for a clash of civilizations, okay? Clash of civilizations between, if you will, Islamic civilization and Christian civilization, Christian/European civilization. Samuel Huntington followed up with an article that received enormous coverage, translated into many languages, called The Clash of Civilizations. And that was the early 1990s. In 1996, he brought out a book called The Clash of Civilizations. And in there, he talked about the fact that in the sort of post-fall of the Soviet Union, the potential enemies and fights would be in terms of clashing civilizations. And in particular, he cited Chinese and Islamic civilization vis-a-vis Western civilization. Okay? And with regard to Islam itself, whereas in his article, he said Islam has bloody borders, for which some of us criticized him and said, you can say Muslim countries have bloody borders, but to say Islam has bloody borders, that's a religion. We don't say that, for example, Christianity has bloody borders. You know, we'll say some European countries have bloody borders. Think about World War I, World War II, etc. In his book, he extended that statement to Islam has bloody borders, and in its innards is bloody. In other words, the religion of Islam itself is associated with, if you will, violence, warfare, and terrorism. So, you know, both Islam then and its borders, as well as its innards, you know, was denounced. What followed after that, and right around that time, then was a lot of writing, as well as newspaper articles that began to come out. In the writing, you saw people talking about, yes, clash of civilizations, and it usually was that there's been a historic clash of civilizations. In other words, what we're seeing today between, in those times would have been said, what we're seeing today is something that existed throughout history, you know, the clash between Christian civilizations and Islamic civilization. So Islam then was a civilizational threat, historical. It was also seen increasingly as a political threat. And you could think about the politics with regard to Iran, export of the revolution, and then the kinds of violence that occurred after that, you know, right up through and down to today. And then the final one was the demographic threat. Okay, and this would be written of in the 1990s. As I put it, I wrote a book called The Islamic Threat, Myth or Reality. And in the second edition, I changed the title of the last chapter to The Muslims Are Coming, The Muslims Are Coming, because that's where I was going to be emphasizing the growth of Islamophobia, which was based on these three things that I said: civilizational, historical, and demographic threat. Muslim populations. For example, one author wrote and said, in Turkey, which has become very sort of, you know, I'm not sorry, not Turkey. In France, which has become very secular and not religious, you have Turkish doctors who are families of, let's say, six or eight children, okay, supporting themselves, these doctors, by performing, you know, what's become in vogue or okay, which is abortions. And so the demographic threat that Muslims have large families, and that in the more secular West, they're smaller families, and that having these larger families means you're going to have a population threat. Now, think about how in the last 10 years, that's continued to be the case. For example, surveys that have been done in many European countries show, in France and others, that people there in a survey have a very distorted notion of how large the Muslim population is. You know, often it's 2 or 3 times, they state, larger than it actually is. And I've heard that said even more recently by people who are very rational. We're not even talking here about people who are very Islamophobic, anti-Muslim, you know, specifically anti-Muslim. Just the idea that, well, the population is there and it's exploding, you know. And so then that question also becomes with regard to the Muslim population in America, but it's also come up with other groups like the Latino population now. Okay. Okay, how has this played out? How do we see the situation today? Well, sadly, the situation today is that we've taken, you know, there's a statement that's sort of like, what is it? 3 steps forward, 2 steps back, and then the idea that, well, then it's only 1 step to go forward again. That's not the case. I would say in the last several decades, certainly from the 70s on, there was far more discussion of pluralism, even religious pluralism, far more the beginnings of dialogue between first Christians and Jews, and then Christians, Catholics, and Protestants, and then extending it to interfaith dialogue with other faiths. We have populations, as I just said, for now several decades, in significant populations of Muslims, both in Europe and America, and many are in the system, become professional. Certainly today, if you look in the last decade in Britain, you've had Muslims in the cabinet and in high office and in parliament. And in the US, we have a number of Muslims who are in Congress, but also in professional jobs, you know, et cetera. You know, many of them, as if you will, and we have data on this, as successful economically and professionally as any group. In fact, some data has said that Muslims are second to American Jews in terms of level of education. And Muslim males and females have college and or postdoc university degrees, the same sort of almost same numbers, both moving in that kind of direction. But what we've also seen is the emergence of white nationalism and supremacism. You see a way in which you have people warning about people of, quote, a different color and a different background. So a strong anti-immigrant, anti-Muslim, and even anti-Semitic attitude developing among white nationalists and supremacists. If they're in Europe, we'll talk about, Europe as a white nation with a Christian civilization. Even if in some of those countries people are practicing their faith in the numbers of others, they will see it as rooted in this different Christian civilization, and also the white side of it. Think of the number of countries in Europe where there's a single language that's been spoken since they were created, where everybody is white, and in some countries, in Northern European countries, both of those are true, as well as often you can even say that many people in some of the Northern European countries look quite similar in terms of having blonde hair, blue eyes, etc. And then it becomes the browning, if you will. That browning, whether you're talking about Black people, whether you're talking about people from Latin America, and certainly if you're talking about people from the Muslim world, in society itself. And I've seen that over the years as I've gone to lecture, for example, in the UK and many other countries, the differences years ago and what we would see today. Now, what that's meant is that in countries like the UK, France, Germany, and especially in countries like Hungary and Poland, you have major issues coming from these political parties, but also the attitudes of a significant minority of the population with regard to people being anti-immigrant, anti-Muslim, and also anti-Semitic. You also have a Christian theology, a far-right Christian theology in America, in particular, far-right evangelicals who are very anti-Muslim and who basically believe that America was founded as a Christian nation, it should be a Christian nation, and that the primary citizens, and leaders in society and definers of society should be Christian, and see the current society as a sinful secular society. So these are people who believe that the U.S. once was and should once again be a Christian nation, that it should transform public life, build a society that is self-consciously and exclusively Christian, dependent on the work of Christians, rather than based on, a broader consensus, if you will, of the population in terms of equality in defining the nature of the country. You see a strong attitude towards that when you look at somebody most recently like Franklin Graham, who is the son of Billy Graham and nothing like Billy Graham. And Franklin Graham, who's always had a problem with Islam, has always seen it as evil. Even when George Bush said that it wasn't, and he was a supporter of George Bush, no, Islam is evil, and he's talked about that a lot. More recently in an interview, he said that the coronavirus that we have is a punishment from God for the election of Obama. And of course, he saw Obama as, when we see Obama as a Muslim, that whole birther issue. We see the growth of anti-Semitism, as I said, in the US and Europe. But we also see globally a problem with Islamophobia. When we look at the Chinese government and the Uyghurs, when we look at Myanmar and the Rohingya, when we look at India today, India, which identifies itself as a secular democracy, has moved in a different direction. Under Modi, it's basically moved towards basically declaring and attempting to implement the idea that, the overwhelmingly dominant number of people in India are Hindu. It doesn't matter to them that there are 200 million or more Muslims there, but that in fact this should be at the end of the day, a Hindu nation and culture. And so we see in the last year or two legislation, which attempts to and discriminates against Muslims. We see an Indian government whose ministers, more recently, with regard to the corona, have used the phrase, the health minister, corona jihad, because a Muslim group, Tablighi Jamaat, ostensibly had a meeting in which people came together, did not separate. And the idea is, that and the way other Muslims are acting winds up promoting corona and spreading it in the country. And so we've seen a great deal of violence against Muslims, including the murder of some Muslims. And also another minister who referred to Talibani crime, a Talibani crime. And we see that attitude playing out in terms of India and Kashmir moving in the last year or two to actually formally annexing Kashmir as part of the country, and to the way in which it has controlled Kashmir and controlled the inability of Kashmiri Muslims in terms of functioning within their own society, in terms of the internet, etc. Well, are there signs of hope? There are signs, but frankly, I had to think much longer about that. Some obvious signs of hope are that, unlike years ago, when I first began to teach, and when in fact students were not interested in other world religions, and certainly not in Islam. And so even when they became in the 70s and 80s interested in religion, for many of them, it was Hinduism and Buddhism. And then if they did study Islam, it was like in a post-Iran Revolution, period. Today we have many students who've gone in high school, sometimes in grammar school, in world history courses, who've been introduced to other religions, including Islam, and the history of them. And when they come to universities like Georgetown, now in the School of Foreign Service, unlike when I first taught there in 1993, a fair number of my students already have some background in world religions, have done something on the Middle East and Islam. And certainly there are kids that now will come and have had maybe a year of Arabic, for example, in their background. In terms of the Muslim population, we have now second, third generation pushing towards fourth, where you really see the success of many Muslims professionally, from small business owners and people who drive for limo services, etc., to physicians, large numbers, as I said earlier, physicians, lawyers, engineers, educators. For the first time, we have not only many professors, but even administrators, who come from Arab and or Muslim backgrounds, and senior administrators. And as I did it recently, I noted that having done hiring, going back to the 1980s, been a department chair, etc., running the national programs at Holy Cross, and then since 1993, been at Georgetown. When we would advertise a position, let's say a position in Islam, we might or might not have, as a finalist, a Muslim candidate. Whereas the last time we did a hiring, or 2 times ago, I'm sorry, was maybe, I think about, let's say 6 or 7 years ago, all 3 candidates were Muslim. As it turned out, all 3 candidates were also Americans who had converted to Islam. And so one of my Muslim colleagues now is Jonathan Brown, who is a very prominent Muslim scholar and lectures regularly in the UK and across the world, etc. So what we're seeing then is that presence of Muslims in our Congress. At first we had just one person a number of years ago who was elected to Congress, and it was a big to-do for some of the right wing, including the right wing in Congress, and especially when he wanted to take the oath of office, not on the Bible, but on the Quran. And more recently, we've had 2 women who are Muslim who are elected, and we have a male who's also Andre Carson, who's also in Congress. And Muslims are seen throughout our society increasingly. Muslim NGOs are now, many of them, very visible and very prominent. So something like, for example, Islam Relief is an organization that in recent years goes to major catastrophes, including catastrophes that have occurred in the U.S. and other places where the primary victims may not be Muslim. Just as we've seen Christian groups that deal with catastrophes overseas, whether they're Catholic or Protestant, who go and offer their relief services. I think with regard to the coronavirus, we're in a very interesting situation. I'll try to bring this to a close. I have some other points, but I'd rather bring it to a close and deal with questions. The coronavirus is unlike anything that any of us who are alive today can say they ever experienced before. What we have is a pandemic. We have the equivalent of what would have been called a global plague in the old days. So we have a pandemic which is global. It's not just a matter of saying, well, it happened in China or it happens in the US. What we've seen is it has moved through virtually all the countries in the world. And in many instances, in only the last 6 weeks, has proven to be an extraordinarily strong threat in many of the societies. And this pandemic is such that we're not talking about just a small group of people and society can continue to function. But what you've seen is the shutting down of societies, of the economic sector, also in terms of socializing, and also in terms of the religious sector. I was on the other day, if you go to the American Bar Association, their website, you can see a discussion that they had with 5 lawyers talking about religious freedom, religion and religious freedom in this corona period. So for example, looking at issues like where do Jews and Muslims stand when one says that in fact you have to shelter and basically shut down your usual large services, the Jummah prayer, or in Judaism, the prayer on the Sabbath, which occurs in the synagogue, which is a community, getting together. So we're dealing with this pandemic, which is raising all kinds of questions now, a crisis, and it's a pandemic in which when we look at it, we don't know what the answer is going to be. We don't even know what the answer is going to be in terms of when will it be safe for us not to be sheltering. My wife and I have been here basically in our home for a couple of months, basically, self-isolation. And we don't know when really that's going to end significantly. We see governments struggling with when can we open up a bit? When can we open up the economic sector a bit? But we also hear others saying, we have to do it carefully. And even if we do that people often will be expected if they're going to be going, in any place where you're going to have a lot of people in the same place, they'll have to be wearing a mask, minimally, especially if they're not going to be distancing. So they'll minimally have to wear a mask, or as Governor Cuomo said, a mask or a covering, for the face. Because as you know, the danger is if somebody has it and they cough, etc., that infects other people. And as I'm sure you know, it's estimated that at least 25% of those that have the coronavirus don't know it, don't feel any side effects, and may get through it, but that in fact they are people who are infected and can infect other people. And so it's other people who can then get it, and because it's such an erratic disease, can wind up dying from it. But what we see too, though, is what occurred before, and I think we'll see even more, in responding to the rise of the far right in Europe and America. You see more vibrant, not just Muslim groups growing up in Europe and in America to respond to anti-Muslim behavior. That is groups that deal with civil liberties, groups that deal with legal issues, groups that deal with political issues and issues of violence and discrimination. But in fact, major organizations that deal with these kinds of issues. Human Rights Watch, for example. In other words, major human rights groups that are global. The UN, or when you look at, for example, in the States, the Southern Poverty Law Center. We even have more recently, the head of the FBI said the major threat in the US, the first #1 threat is from these right-wing groups, these white nationalist supremacist groups. And one would have to recognize that in a number of countries also in Europe, and certainly in terms of elections and political parties. you have strong parties that have developed. So I think that what people are going to be doing now is not only looking now, but we're going to be looking to what kind of world are we going to have after this, and what kind of lessons are we going to learn. There'll be positive lessons. We've learned how technology can be harnessed to do the kinds of things we're doing here, to do what we're doing at Georgetown, which is educating our students at home because we can't have them in the university. Businesses are learning that they can function in a corporate way in much of what they do by having people at home rather than in offices, and we'll see that changing pattern line. More and more businesses and others will say that for a lot of meetings when you don't need to be face to face, you don't need to be having people all the time traveling internationally to see the other. In fact, you can have business meetings, on the internet. And certainly we're going to be facing the issue of where do we go from here. And one of the things that's going to stand out for people is the very thing that you see is being celebrated in Europe and America, and that is the recognition of people more and more that the debt that they owe to doctors, nurses, caretakers, first responders, regardless of their religion or their color. And you see that in places where people will applaud every morning and every night for those who have risked their lives to save other people. And those people that they're applauding are people of different backgrounds. There was a report last week that 6 or 7 out of the 10 physicians that had died were Muslim in background. And certainly when we look at our populations and realize that so many of these people are there. In fact, in one of the European countries, the country is actually opening up to legitimating and accepting the medical credentials of physicians who've come, immigrant physicians who come here, and nurses who've come here, who very often have to wait a number of years before they can qualify and get into that main system. And these people are coming forward, because this is who they are. So I'll end there, and we can talk about anything you might like to talk about.
Okay, thank you very much for that, Dr. Esposito. I'll start off with 1 or 2 questions myself before we ask our audience. We've got a few questions from the audience. Again, you'll be typing your questions to the right of the YouTube live stream in the chat section. So you ask your questions there. We'll try and get to as many as we can in the limited time we have. Just this question myself, Dr. Esposito. Who can we say is responsible for this, decreasing this misunderstanding of Muslims? Is it Muslims themselves? Is it school and education, religious organizations or other institutions, or government agencies? Or is it more collective? And what should they be all doing? Similar things, different approaches?
I think that obviously, what gives a negative spin in some of the situations we're talking about, certainly with regard to Muslims, is the realities of Al Qaeda and ISIS, and whether it's remembering 9/11 or remembering ISIS and the way in which it not only spread so fast it seemed like wildfire, but also the way they got media attention. Remember, was for many months using beheadings, deliberately using that because they knew they'd draw teeth, etc. But I think the other side of it is that you have a strong group of people who are anti-Muslim writers, political organizers, and who have groups. So, for example, in America, several studies have been done. By the way, if you go to bridge.georgetown.edu, bridge.georgetown.edu, you'll see a lot of data on what I'm talking about and stories, etc. The reality is that you've got a significant number of people who have been incredibly funded. Several studies done in America show that as much as $220 million, I'll say that again, $220 million. And those studies, by the way, are based on looking at the tax return documents from some of these organizations and individuals. Who are they? Where do they give their money? How much do they give? Okay. $220 million given throughout the last 10, 12 years or so. to support these writers, these websites, etc. So if you go on the internet, and especially now when people are at home more and more, and so even more relying on social media for their news, their entertainment, you see websites, not just like Jihad Watch, and you figure, okay, I know what that's going to be, pushing out there, but they say things like American Thinker, Family Security, these kinds of names that look perfectly good, perfectly legitimate. Pajama Media, which is a very conservative website, but in being very conservative, very often is taking anti-immigrant and anti-Muslim positions. And you see the same thing occurring with regard to anti-Semitism. Its head has been raised in the U.S. and in countries like France and others in Europe to a degree that nobody expected. We knew anti-Semitism was still there and it had to be dealt with in our society. But when you look at some of the tragedies that have occurred, the violence that's occurred, at synagogues and towards Jews. So you have people out there who are, Muslim haters and Jewish haters, and we've seen it's begun to spread. Sikhs have also, had problems. So I think, we don't want to underestimate the fact that there are people out there. And by the way, the people out there are not simply uneducated people. Some of them are very sophisticated. I mean, look at the Conservative Party in Great Britain and the accusations with regard to the number of conservatives that have made or supported anti-Semitic and anti-Muslim kinds of comments. And those accusations have been made not only in the media, but have actually been made in some cases by people who are members of the British Parliament or in the British cabinet, like Baroness Warsi, for example. And the same thing is true in our country. If you look at some of the people who run some of these sites, many of them, have very good educations. A number of them, frankly, two of them were graduates of Georgetown. Steve Bannon, who was a major advisor to President Trump and is super right-wing, believes in a clash between Christianity and Islam. In fact, wants to see it as a kind of cleansing. Attended Georgetown University. And so this is what makes it very dangerous. There are people who have good educations, good skills, and have access to money. If they don't have that money, they get it from other people to do what they do. The other side is nowhere near as influential or possible. That is, there are no, great string of major organizations that deal with Islamophobia. There are a number of us that do it. But how long we will do it depends on fundraising. It's not as if we have major funders that are just waiting in the queue. And one of the problems is that, for example, groups often and people who are the victims. You have some very successful Muslims, not only overseas, but some very successful Muslims in America. But when it comes to major funding on some of these issues, they're invisible, they're silent, and they don't step up the way others who are on the other side wind up stepping up.
Okay, thank you, John. I'll take some, I've got some questions from the audience now for you. And we've got quite a few, but I'll try and pick the quick, as many as I can. We've got one here. In today's scenario, what can you tell us about, in inverted commas, American Muslim, end of commas, American Muslim identity, which is a rising phenomena?
Well, I think that American Muslim identity, I don't know exactly. I would say that American Muslim identity is very pluralistic and very diverse. I forget, we have, I think, at least among our American Muslim population, people whose forefathers and foremothers came from, I forget, maybe 80 countries, 100 countries. And so people who are second and third generation have that, but you also then have the diversity of the culture. And it's very much a little similar from my point of view to the way Catholics were. That is, you have Catholics who are Irish, French, Polish, etc. And they share a common faith, but their culture often plays a very strong role. And so there can even be divisions there. When I was a young man growing up, and I remember when I was a young professor in Massachusetts, there was a Catholic church, an Irish Catholic church on one corner, and it also had its own school. And across the street was a American French background Catholic church and its school. You see, so you had that and that cultural difference also could be very much part of sometimes the diversity that could occur, and even the competition and even the conflict. And in America, you have a significant number of African Americans. You have others who identify as simply Black American because they're not in their heritage coming from Africa. That group is probably about a third of Muslims. And then you have this very, very diverse group. And the divisions there also religiously are between those that are very conservative to those who are more progressive. And so there can be at times differences and even tensions, or mosques like churches can be identified by, who the leader is, the religious leader, and some will be identified as more progressive and others more conservative. So there's a lot of, diversity there.
Okay, thank you, John, for that. Here's another question. As you have stated, Muslims are serving in every part of society in America: politicians, elected officials, physicians, engineers, etc. Can you share your thoughts on where you see lack of representation, where Muslim Americans should focus on?
Well, I can tell you that regardless of who the president has been, whether it was Bush, whether it was Obama, for a variety of reasons, I used to say the following when I give a talk: where do we see Muslims in the top levels of our government, in the cabinet, or as ambassadors? And in public talks, I would often say to an audience, okay, now tell me about 5 Muslims who are ambassadors, US ambassadors. And I would go 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, there'd be 0, maybe 1. And ironically, during Obama's time, and Obama was very pluralistic. Remember, part of his heritage, even though he identified as a Christian, was that he had a Muslim father. He also very much was aware. Obama visited mosques in Cairo and in Turkey and Indonesia. He did not visit a mosque or get photographed near one until I believe it was his last year, his 8th year in the presidency. So because there was this sense, and it was raised a lot, that the so-called birther issue, which in fact President Trump was very much one of the people responsible for, that in fact Obama was a Muslim, was born a Muslim, and that it was being hidden even when the documentation was provided that existed. And you still have Americans, particularly considerable percentage of conservative Republicans, who still believe that he was a Muslim. And so the statement that Franklin Graham made, that Christian minister, is rooted in that kind of mentality. Where we also need to see more Muslims is in media. Now that's been happening, but not enough, but we need to see more. You now can see in a number of major media where reporters will have a American Muslim background. And here when I say American Muslim, I'm not just talking in a narrow sense about whether or not and how religious they are. Because we identify people in America, they can be identified as, and identify themselves as Jewish, Catholic, etc., or be identified by others as Muslim. And it could be that they are cultural. That is, that they come from the culture, that their parents are Muslim, and then they may not, the particular person may or may not be practicing, let's say, their faith, even if their parents practice their faith. But we don't have that kind of visibility. It's an issue in America, and a legitimate issue, when people say, do we have Jews in the cabinet? Can a Jew become president? And we're going to see that more and more, an issue with regard to Latinos and Latinas, or Latinxs, as people say. And it'll be quite a while before it ever winds up being a Muslim, simply because there still is this very strong, anti-Muslim and kind of paranoid approach, where people can make up almost any story and people will be willing to believe it, about what Muslims think or not. I've done talk shows or when I speak publicly, and people will get up and say things as if it's a proven fact. And when you press them, it's because they've heard it, in the media, or they've run into it in social media, where people will be saying things like, what's happening right now. The real issue is that they're not going to touch Muslims with regard to closing down the mosque, but they're going to close down churches, or there's going to be, more discrimination, against, people who are, and they'll say this of immigrants also, but, that there'll be more discrimination unless you're, have a Latino background or a Muslim background. When we look at our reality in our society, that's not the case. We're not there yet.
Okay. Thank you again, John. We've got another question here. Some Muslim American leaders hail Muslim leaders like Erdogan and others for their Islamic leadership. What is your message to Muslim Americans who live in a democratic country but yet praise authoritarian leaders in their homelands?
Yeah, I think that's a big issue for some has to do with the nature of a number of governments and people's backgrounds. That is, when we talk about who America's allies are, historically, in a number of instances, over the years, America, when it came to the Middle East, was on the one hand, we were a country that talked about democracy, and the whole notion was we're going to promote democracy. But the fact is that during the Cold War, we did not seek to promote democracy in many parts of Latin America, because we move against any kind of movement that was very progressive or sort of leftist, because it was simply brushed as Catholic. And certainly, in general, we supported authoritarian regimes wherever they were, including in the Middle East. We have a whole history of supporting that. So when you look today, one of the issues when you look today is you're looking at governments as diverse as Saudi Arabia, the UAE, Turkey, Egypt, a number of those governments. And we have populations of people who come from that background, and these divisions exist very strongly in our own society. In other words, the positions that many people in these backgrounds will be taking publicly. So people will see somebody who comes from a particular country, but really see a very diverse attitude. An example would be with regard to Turkey, looking at the AKP, and then also the question of the AKP vis-a-vis the Gulenists and the Kurds. When you look at Egypt, it often was in some past years where you would have some, not all, Egyptian Christians, really talking about the danger of Islam, but being supportive of some of the authoritarian rulers in Egypt, even if they didn't think that they were defending them enough. And you had others, Egyptians, whether they were Christian, and certainly many Muslims, basically saying Mubarak has been in for 30 years. Ben Ali's been in for 30 years. Gaddafi's been, etc. And so that kind of debate and tension within countries comes to the United States, to the extent that you have people who are first, second generation, or even third generation, and still have a strong identity with their roots, as it were.
Thank you, John. We've got another question now. How do the Crusades influence us now? Huge question. Can you give any sort of answer?
Yeah, it's very funny. When I was a young academic, I still hadn't got my doctorate, and I had to speak at a major conference, and there were 4 panelists, let's say. 3 of them were very senior people, and I was the junior person. I was very nervous because I think it was the first time I was speaking and giving a formal paper. I was also nervous because I was the 4th person, and I had a tight schedule in terms of catching my plane. And the person who chaired the session was a very prominent Muslim scholar named Fazlur Rahman, University of Chicago, who come from Pakistan originally. And he began by saying to his colleagues, we have this very nervous young man. It's the first time that he's in the paper. He needs to catch a plane. He said, so could I ask all the speakers to skip over the first part of their paper, which deals with the Crusades and European colonialism, and get to the specific topic that they're talking about right now, okay? Now, in terms of the Crusades, yes, the Crusades get picked up and played often by people who are of the far right, and many of them don't even have a sense of who started the Crusades. From their point of view, they think the Muslims started the Crusades, and that in fact the Christians won at the end of the Crusades. Far more complicated. I mean, the famous battle cry was from Pope Urban. God wills it in terms of the Crusades. But people will basically go back and say, they will identify as many with the idea that, well, Christian civilization was the Crusades versus the Muslims and this incredible threat and spread of the Muslims, rather than having a much more complicated attitude. Now, the Crusader argument also comes up in Muslim countries. Certainly, particularly when I was younger and I would go out and lecture, but it continued. I'd be in situations where people would be bringing up the Crusades, that is Muslims, and the Crusader mentality. And half the time I'd have to say to them, for many people like myself, I went through a whole educational system where if we referred to the Crusades, it was in passing. We really didn't, get into it. I mean, that's past history. But that has certainly, come out, comes out in the kind of rhetoric that these anti-Muslim authors, for example, there's a book that's come out recently, and it will look at the engagement of the Muslim world and the West, as it were, historically, and the way it paints it in terms of these battles is exactly as I kind of put it. Where it's the Crusaders were all there defending Christianity. When so many of them were there because they were there for the fight, the money, the booty, and if they died, they were told they would go to heaven. But these kinds of references to past history are there. European colonialism is a major issue, and there's certainly an incredible legacy from European colonialism. But you can't explain everything today simply in terms of European, colonialism. And the same is true with America. In some policies you can, but in other policies there's a diversity when you move to administrations. And certainly when you look at the current administration, we've never had a president who says Islam hates us. And when questioned about it in terms of, well, do you mean Muslims and lots of Muslims, or you mean religion of Islam? And it's, well, no, you decide, but in fact, there are lots of them. Islam hates us, that kind of thing. And most of us would have never thought that we'd have this notion of a Muslim ban, which is so broad, or that we'd have a member of Congress who went to Princeton and Harvard and basically said the only immigrants we should let in are Syrian Christians. That kind of language and rhetoric from people that are, as it were, that bright. My father used to say to his three sons when we really disagree with my dad, when he really got frustrated, he'd say, "You're too bright to be that stupid." And I think that, certainly when you look at, for example, this administration, many of its members, if you go to bridge.georgetown.edu, you can look up, we have a group of what we call fact sheets. So all we provide are facts, it's not an editorial on anything. Facts on members of the current administration, as well as a lot of other people and groups that have that are anti-Muslim, but particular members of the current administration. It can be, you'll be, I think, really surprised at how a fair number of our senior people in senior positions have been associated and are associated with some of the strong anti-Muslim groups like Act for America.
Okay, thank you very much, Dr. Esposito. Do you have time for one more question?
Sure, I got plenty of time.
Okay, excellent. In your article, and I quote, "Claiming the Center, political Islam in transition," you raise two questions. Who's Islam and what Islam? What is your response to these questions regarding xenophobia in the USA?
I'm trying to think of where this question is coming from. I would say, I think that the distinction that has to be made so that people who are watching this and aren't aware of what I was talking about is that when you want to talk about Islam, and I say who's Islam, and that's a debate among Muslims, who are the authorities? We know that the Quran and the traditions of the Prophet are authoritative, but who are the authorities that, for example, today, that people look to? They're religious leaders. And it becomes important because there's a spectrum of religious leaders, okay? From ultra-conservative people to conservative to reform-minded, progressive, etc. So who's Islam? Who are the people that somebody's reading, and then what do these people say? And sometimes these people agree on a lot, but sometimes they are diametrically opposed. For example, the question of when is it legitimate to use violence? And this is true in faiths too. Among Christians, when do you have the legitimate use, of violence? And then what Islam? What interpretation of Islam? There are diverse interpretations of Islam. Again, some super conservative, which can be a real problem on issues of both political and social policy. The really conservative people who have encouraged their population to say you shouldn't vote. You really can't be a citizen in a society that's not a Muslim society, or encourage isolating oneself. By isolating, I mean just be among ourselves. You can go out for a job and function in a pluralistic society, but basically your friends, the people you hang out with should be sort of family and other Muslims, rather than what you discover in a pluralistic society. I, who was raised and only knew Italian Catholics in general, 90 to 95% of people I knew until I went away to high school and college, were all Italian Catholic. That notion of pluralism developed to the point where, sure, if you ask me who my friends are, when I rattle them off, you'll discover that some of them are Catholic, lots of them are Muslim. I may even have more Muslim friends than I have Catholic friends, and a fair number of Jewish friends. That's what it means to live in our pluralistic society. And I think that these kinds of tensions you see them generationally between the older generation often, and then the younger generation that is born and raised here, as to how one then articulates one's Muslim identity, and what your attitude and your approach are. And of course, it then plays out when you get to issues like intermarriage, or where you send your kids to school, etc.
Okay, thank you very much, Dr. John Esposito. We appreciate your time today. We've gone over the allotted one hour. We want to thank the more than 100 guests that attended this online session. We will continue during these interesting times to provide online activities. Please spare some time to visit Dr. Esposito's project, the Bridge Initiative, Google Bridge Initiative at Georgetown, and you'll be able to get the important resource that they provide. As well, we've mentioned in the chat section there, we've got numerous links, our various social media, our event email sign up, our website, etc. And of course, event feedback. If you can click on those links and provide your feedback, it would be very much appreciated. We look forward to hosting you in the coming weeks again. I suspect a lot of us will be online through a similar forum. So I want to thank you on behalf of Peace Silence Institute New York, and thank you, Dr. John Esposito. Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you. Enjoyed it.
Have a good day, everyone. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.